The Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars are well known for their grand battles, large armies, often hundreds of thousands, facing off against one another in epic clashes that defined warfare for decades to come. What the period is not known for are its sieges. Napoleon defined warfare during his campaigns with quick movements, decisive attacks, and reliance on his ability to adapt. By its nature, a siege runs counter to most of the tactics Napoleon and other generals at the time favored. That is not to say that sieges did not occur, however, and there are a number of examples where sieges played critical roles in the conduct of campaigns and the wars in general. Though Napoleon never found himself on the defending side of a siege, his early career revolved around a number of notable sieges. In 1793, he first made a name for himself during the siege of Toulon, where he helped lead the French to victory in recapturing the critical port city. During his first Italian campaign in northern Italy, his campaign revolved around the 8-month siege of Mantua, as he defeated repeated Austrian attempts to relieve the besieged city. His first real military failure was during a siege as well, when his army was stopped at the walls of Acre during the 1799 invasion of Egypt and Syria. Napoleon's offensive nature did not mean that he didn't understand the value of properly fortified works. He would fund the construction of a number of defensive works during his reign, and would make use of fortresses or fortified cities during his campaigns as a way to assert his control in a hostile continent. Such works protected supply lines and would slow down enemy movements, buying time for his own forces in his later campaigns. Other French generals faced far more siege warfare, both on the offensive and defensive sides. The Peninsular War in particular was full of notable and important sieges, as a combination of the country's terrain and determined populace meant that any city of sufficient size could provide a stubborn resistance to an enemy army. To understand the role of sieges played during this period, and why various sieges played out the way they did, one should first look towards the nature of siege warfare during the period. By the arrival of the French Revolution, the proper way to conduct a siege or build a fortress had been gotten down to a science. Vauban was a French royal officer who specialized in engineering during the late 1600s. His efforts greatly standardized the construction of fortifications and the process to conduct a siege. The methods that came to dominate sieges during his time would largely remain the standard practice up to and including the Napoleonic Wars. For Vauban, the challenge posed towards fortress construction was the increased effectiveness of artillery in reducing a fortress's defenses. The solution Vauban and other engineers of his time came up with was a complex, layered series of works using earth and stone to create an in-depth series of defenses that would dramatically reduce the effectiveness of artillery at range, while allowing the defender's artillery and infantry maximum field of fire. Taking advantage of local terrain, such a fortification could be extremely hard for an attacker to take without serious investments of time and energy. It was Vauban, too, however, who devised the most effective way to siege and eventually take such a fortress. He would construct a series of parallel trenches creeping towards an enemy fortification, constructing protected firing positions for artillery and allowing guns to be moved closer to the enemy fortifications so as to become more effective. The defenders would gradually be forced to abandon their fortifications step by step, first the outer works, then the glacis, an earthen slope that protected the stone fortifications from long-range fire. Attackers would then need to overcome several more defensive obstacles, including ditches, outer bastions, and layered walls capable of allowing defending artillery to cover every inch of the attacker's approach. To take such complex fortresses, enemy cannons and outer fortifications had to be silenced or taken one by one until artillery could be brought close enough to establish a breach in the main wall. Only then could infantry be sent forth to assault the breach and claim the fortress or city protected within. In some cases, tunneling work would be required to deal with particularly tough fortifications. Mines would be placed below defensive works and detonated, allowing attackers to launch an assault or move forward with the siege to the next layer of defenses. This process was lengthy and expensive, but if carried out to completion would result in the capture or surrender of the fortification. The defenders, of course, knew this well, and so would conduct an active defense, sallying out or conducting tunneling warfare of their own to destroy approaching trenches and gun positions. With both sides generally knowing the course of a siege, incentives arose for both sides to not carry out a siege to its full extent. Should an attacking army have to assault a breach and into the town beyond, then they were likely to receive heavy casualties. the result being chaos and pillaging likely to follow a successful assault as discipline broke down. Defenders, too, often did not desire to fight to the last man or starve to death behind their walls, and so would prefer to surrender honorably to fight another day. A delicate balance therefore arose between both sides of a siege. It became common practice for those under siege to not hold out to the extreme of their ability. Once a breach was made, or the defender felt they had mounted a sufficient delay of the enemy, with their honor intact, they would offer to surrender. In exchange, the besieging army would usually offer generous terms to the garrison. This could be as simple as promising peaceful occupation of the city, or even could consist of the defenders being allowed to march out under arms and return to their own lines. Should one side believe the other had not acted honorably, or found the offer of capitulation insufficient, then a siege may well continue until the attacking army was driven off by a relief force, or the defenders was forced into a total surrender. No siege was exactly the same. The exact design of a fortification, circumstances around why a siege was being fought, and the condition of both armies were all variables that influenced the course and results of a siege. Add to this the fact that the longer a siege wore on, the more losses would be incurred due to fighting, disease, and general attrition for both sides. A siege was not an endeavor to be undertaken lightly. No siege took place in a vacuum, and arguably the most important factor for both sides was the issue of supplies. For the defender, no defense could hold out indefinitely without resupply. A garrison would eventually run out of food or ammunition. For the attacker as well, supplies was paramount. It took far more resources to be the besieger than the defender. Without a constant source of soldiers, ammunition, food, and other general material required to conduct a siege, the defenders could hold out as long as their supplies lasted. By the time of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, the number of cannons available to armies had drastically increased, along with the general increase in the size of armies, which meant that the timely arrival of supplies was critical. Sieges often consumed thousands or even tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition for the cannons alone. The 2.5-year-long unsuccessful French siege of Cadiz during the Peninsular War is an example of what happens when an imbalance of supplies favors the defender. At the southern tip of Spain, the port city of Cadiz was at the very end of French supply lines. Over the course of the siege, 60,000 men and 600 pieces of artillery under Marshals Victor and Soult would attempt to take the city from a combined Spanish, Portuguese, and British force. Positioned at the end of a narrow peninsula, the city benefited from natural terrain, limiting avenues of attack and allowing for continued resupply by the British Navy. The city was also protected by a number of nearby forts that helped protect the natural harbor and nearby roads. Worse for the French was the issue of supplies. Unless imperial soldiers were present in force, then the countryside belonged to the guerrillas. Any supply convoy to support the siege had to travel nearly 1,000 kilometers, largely through potentially hostile territory. Siege cannons were heavy, and the ammunition as well was not easily transported through rough terrain. Along with the many other resources required, supplies often struggled to reach the siege lines as guerrillas raided convoys and skirmished with the rear of French siege works. In comparison, the defenders were well supplied with material and a steady stream of reinforcements. While British attempts to relieve the siege failed, and some of Cadiz's outer works were slowly taken, the siege was eventually abandoned due to Wellington's victory at Salamanca, which threatened to cut off French forces completely. Unable to take their siege guns with them, 600 pieces of artillery had to be abandoned. Other French sieges during the Peninsular War saw more success. In 1810, the siege of Ciudad Rodrigo against a Spanish garrison is an example of a successful French siege and provides a contrast to the more aggressive British sieges that would take place in the following years. In 1810, the French were attempting to mount a third invasion into Portugal. However, standing in their way was the Spanish city of Ciudad Rodrigo. Ney commanding 6 corps, consisting of 28,000 men, who besieged the city to open a path for the rest of the army under Massena to invade Portugal. Opposing him was a Spanish garrison of 5,000 men. Again, the French suffered from the usual difficulties of operating in Spain. Guerrilla attacks meant supplies were always strained and quick movements difficult. The Spanish, however, did not benefit from access to the sea and were completely cut off from resupply. Wellington, who was nearby, believed his army was not large enough to face the French, and so did not attempt to relieve the siege, despite Spanish hopes. Over the course of 10 weeks, Ney's men dug trenches and seized the outer defenses, despite heavy Spanish resistance. Gradually, the French approached closer to the city before breaching the counterscarp, the outer wall of the ditch just below the main wall of the city. From there, the French were able to create breaches in the main wall in preparation for an assault. Knowing an assault was soon to follow the breaches, the Spanish commander of the garrison surrendered honorably. Overall, this siege followed the more traditional course of siege warfare during the period, acting as a delaying action as the French slowly invested the city, took the outer defenses, and prepared for the final assault. After its surrender, the city would be pillaged by the French, despite Ney promising otherwise as part of the terms of surrender. Even so, the city did not experience the true brutality that would have followed an assault, or the suffering of starvation and sickness had the siege lasted many more months. 2 years later, in 1812, Ciudad Rodrigo would again be besieged, this time by the British. In contrast to the French siege, and highlighting the more aggressive stance Wellington took toward siege warfare, the city would hold out barely 2 weeks. Unlike the Spanish garrison, which consisted of over 5,000 men, the French garrison numbered less than half that. The weak French garrison played into Wellington's aggressiveness, as the outer defenses that had greatly slowed the French in their siege were quickly taken by the British. Over the course of a 5-day period, nearly 10,000 rounds would be fired into the walls, creating 2 breaches. An assault would quickly be launched, and despite French resistance, would take the city at a cost of roughly 200 dead and 900 wounded during the assault, out of a force of about 10,000 men. Angry troops subsequently sacked the city, but the British had captured a key fortress on the route into Spain in a very short period of time. Such aggressive tactics, however, came with great risk, as would be demonstrated that same year during the siege of Badajoz. Unlike the understrength garrison at Ciudad Rodrigo, the city of Badajoz was fully manned by 5,000 Frenchmen. Just as before, the British were aggressive with their siege works, and despite French sallyouts, one numbering some 1,500 men, to disrupt the siege lines, 2 breaches would be made on the main wall within 3 weeks. Wasting no time, and concerned with rumors of Marshal Soult marching to relieve the siege, orders were given to launch an assault. The risks between a steady, methodical approach, favored by the French, and the aggressive tactics by the British, are highlighted by the result of the assault. Knowing an attack would follow the creation of a breach, the French were more than prepared and on high alert. Typically, the vanguard of an assault on a breach would be given the title of Forlorn Hope. They were the most likely to be killed in the attack, while also being the most prestigious position of an assault. On the night of April 6th, the assault would commence and immediately be met with murderous fire from the French. The British and Portuguese tried to force the breaches through sheer weight of numbers, but were slaughtered in the attempt and thrown back, the fallen bodies of the dead becoming an additional obstacle for the attackers. Within the span of just a few hours, thousands were either dead or wounded during the attack, with little to show for it. Only 2 formations would manage to make it over the wall, using ladders rather than at the breaches. A division under Picton secured a foothold in the old castle, and another on the opposite side of the city, far away from the fighting. The 2 forces would eventually manage to break into the city, approaching the breaches from the rear. The French were forced to retreat, pulling back across the river and into the untouched San Cristobal fortification, surrendering soon afterwards. British troops would subsequently rampage through the city, with order not being fully restored for over 3 days. British casualties during the siege would number nearly 5,000 dead and wounded, the vast majority during the assault of the breaches. French casualties were less than half that, with fewer than 1,500 dead or wounded, and the rest of the 5,000-man garrison captured. Considering the British came to Badajoz with 27,000 men, more than 5 times the French garrison, such casualty numbers were devastating. Taking the risk of a quick assault had the potential for swift victory, avoiding the expense of a long siege, but also greatly increased the likelihood that thousands may die during the assault, even if it is succeeded. Siege warfare during the period posed a challenge to armies that put emphasis on their mobility. For much of the fighting in Germany, Poland, and Russia, fortresses could be bypassed or taken through sheer momentum, but when terrain restricted movement or sufficient forces occupied a position, it still did force one's opponent to lay siege. The value of fortifications was therefore most often found in its delaying factor. Several notable examples exist of the use of fortifications as a delaying action. In 1800, as Napoleon moved his army back into northern Italy to fight the Austrians during the Second Coalition, a small alpine fort, strategically positioned in a mountain pass, held back the French army for 2 weeks. The garrison, numbering only about 400 men, held back a French army of 40,000. Following the fort's capture, Napoleon would order its destruction. During the War of the Fourth Coalition, in late 1806, early 1807, the Prussians were decisively defeated during the Battle of Jena Austadt, with the result being the collapse of Prussian field armies. A number of formations attempted to retreat to fortresses or major cities to continue their resistance, but failed to hold out for long. In this case, it was the shattered Prussian morale following their defeat that led to the collapse of these fortifications. In 1813, following the disastrous invasion of Russia, Napoleon left behind a number of fortified garrisons in Germany in an attempt to slow down the combined Russian and then Prussian armies from concentrating forces against him. They also served to deny his enemies from strategic logistical points, pressuring them to take these cities before advancing further. While these sieges would serve to significantly delay some coalition forces, the size of armies by this point meant that they had a limited impact in stalling the coalition's advance and deprived Napoleon of badly needed soldiers. Siege warfare during the Napoleonic Wars may have not been a deciding factor, but still played an important part in shaping the conflict. The pace of warfare and its scale diminished the value of massive fortifications, but by no means eliminated them. More than a few sieges would become critical moments during the fighting, and many would lose their lives below the stone walls of an enemy fortress.